The termination letter sat on the polished surface of my new desk, a single perfect sheet of heavy bond paper. The ink of my signature was still faintly damp. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office, the city sprawled below, a glittering, indifferent beast. It had taken me 5 years to get to this room, to this desk, to this single, beautiful, and utterly devastating piece of paper. He walked in at precisely 9 a.m., just as my assistant had instructed. He was wearing a ridiculously expensive suit, the kind that is designed to scream success, but he looked tired. The easy, confident swagger he'd had 5 years ago had been replaced by the weary anxiety of a man who knows on some deep, primal level that he is no longer the predator, but the prey. He saw me sitting in the big leather chair behind the CEO's desk, and his face was a perfect, beautiful portrait of confusion. "Michael," he said, his voice a strange, hesitant squeak. "What are you doing here? Where's Mr. Davenport?" I didn't stand up. I didn't smile. I just looked at him, this man who had stolen my life, and I let him stand there in the uncomfortable silence for a full, delicious 10 seconds. "Mr. Davenport retired last week," I said finally, my voice a calm, quiet thing that carried more weight than any shout ever could. "I'm the new CEO of this company. Please have a seat, Daniel. We have a few things to discuss." He didn't move. He just stared at me, his mind clearly unable to process the impossible reality of the situation. I was the ghost of his past, suddenly sitting on the throne of his future. The man whose wife he had stolen, the man he had dismissed as a weak, unambitious failure, was now his boss. His boss's boss's boss. He thought he had won. He had gotten the woman, the money, the life of power and status. He thought he had left me in the dust, a forgotten casualty of his own glorious ascent. He had no idea that for 5 years every single step of his ascent had been a step into a meticulously designed and patiently laid trap. And I, the man he had broken, had just become the final and most important person he would ever have to answer to. To understand how we arrived at that moment, in that beautiful, sun-drenched corner office, you have to go back 5 years. You have to understand the man I was and the life I thought I had. 5 years ago, I was happy. It was a simple, quiet, and profoundly satisfying happiness. I was 35 years old, a senior project manager at a mid-sized engineering firm. I was good at my job. I was respected. I made a comfortable but not extravagant living. My world was one of blueprints and deadlines and the deep, gratifying pleasure of seeing something complex and difficult built correctly. But the real center of my world was my wife, Chloe. We had been together since college. She was a brilliant, ambitious art curator. She was the beautiful, vibrant color in my black and white world of schematics and calculations. We had a beautiful, modest house in a quiet, tree-lined suburb. We had a life built not on grand gestures, but on 1,000 small, shared moments. Cooking dinner together on a Tuesday night, lazy Sunday mornings with the newspaper, the easy, comfortable silence of two people who knew each other's souls. I thought we were building a forever. And then Daniel entered our lives. He was a new senior executive at Chloe's museum. He was everything I wasn't. He was tall, handsome, with the easy, predatory charm of a man who has never been told no in his life. He came from old money. He drove a Porsche. He wore suits that cost more than my mortgage payment. He was a creature from a different, more glittering, and more ruthless world. Chloe was captivated by him. I saw it immediately. He was her boss, and he took her under his wing. He saw her ambition, and he fed it. He put her in charge of a massive new expansion project for the museum, a project that he was personally overseeing. The late nights at the office began, the weekend strategy sessions, the business trips to art fairs in Miami and London. I was in denial, of course. I told myself this was her big break. Her career was taking off. My job was to be the supportive, loving husband, the anchor. But the distance between us was growing into a chasm. She'd come home from work, her eyes shining with an excitement that had nothing to do with me. She'd talk endlessly about Daniel, about his brilliance, his vision, his power. I was becoming a footnote in the story of her own life. The night the denial became impossible was a cold, rainy Thursday in November. It was our 10th wedding anniversary. I had planned a special evening. I had cooked her favorite meal. I had opened a bottle of the expensive wine we had been saving. She came home at 11. She walked in, her hair damp from the rain, and looked at the beautifully set table with an expression of pure, weary annoyance. "Oh God," she said, "I completely forgot." She hadn't forgotten. That was the lie. The truth was, she just didn't care. "I can't do this anymore, Michael," she said, not looking at me but at her own reflection in the dark window. "I can't live this small life anymore. I want more." I knew what more meant. It was a 6'2" man in a handmade Italian suit. She told me she was leaving me. She told me she was in love with Daniel. She told me it wasn't my fault, that I was a good man, a wonderful husband, but that she had outgrown me. She had outgrown our quiet, simple life. The pain of it was a physical thing, a dull, crushing weight in my chest that made it hard to breathe. But it was what she said next that turned that pain into something else. Something cold and hard and eternal. "Daniel is going to be the next director of the museum," she said, her voice full of a triumphant, almost religious awe. "He's going to be one of the most powerful men in the art world. And he wants me by his side. Not as his employee, as his wife." She looked at me then, for the first time, and her eyes were full of a pity that was more insulting than any hatred. "You're a good project manager, Michael," she said. "You're reliable, you're stable, but you lack vision. You're happy building things for other people. Daniel builds empires." And that was it. I had been weighed, I had been measured, and I had been found wanting. My steady, reliable love was no match for the glittering, seductive promise of an empire. She packed a bag that night and left. The divorce was quick and brutal. She wanted nothing from me, of course. She was trading up. She was leaving my modest suburban house for his penthouse apartment. She was leaving my sensible, reliable life for a world of charity galas and private jets. I was left alone, in the quiet, empty house, with the echoes of her final, devastating verdict. "You lack vision. You build things for other people." For months, I was a ghost. I went to work. I came home. I existed. The grief was a constant, low-grade hum beneath the surface of my life. But as the months bled into a year, the grief began to change. It began to burn. It began to forge itself into something new. A purpose. She was right about one thing. I was a builder. I was a project manager. My entire life was about taking a complex, impossible goal, breaking it down into 1,000 small, manageable steps, and then executing that plan with a relentless, methodical, and obsessive precision. And in the quiet of my empty house, in the long, dark nights of my new, lonely life, a new project began to take shape in my mind. It was the most complex, the most ambitious, and the most insane project of my entire life. Daniel was building an empire. Fine. I would build a better one. And I would build it for one reason, and one reason only. So that one day, I could stand on the top of my empire and look down, and I would have the simple, quiet, and beautiful pleasure of telling him, "You're fired." The plan that I conceived in the ashes of my old life was, by any objective measure, a work of utter madness. It was a 5-year plan, a career path that was not a career but a weapon. The target was not just Daniel. It was the entire world he inhabited. He was a rising star in the world of nonprofit arts administration. His goal, Chloe had told me with such breathless admiration, was to become the director of the biggest, most prestigious museum in the country, a place called the National Institute of Art, a sprawling, powerful institution with a billion-dollar endowment. He was on the fast track, a golden boy being groomed for the throne. My plan was simple in its insane ambition. I had to get there first. I, a mid-level project manager from a suburban engineering firm, had to find a way to climb the treacherous, slippery ladder of the high-stakes art world, a world I knew nothing about, and I had to do it faster and better than a man who had been born into it. It was a 5-year siege, and it required me to completely and utterly reinvent myself. The first year was about education. I was an engineer. I understood structures and logistics and budgets. I knew nothing about art history or museum curation, or most importantly, the dark, complex art of nonprofit fundraising. So I went back to school. At the age of 36, I enrolled in a master's program in arts administration at the local university. I went to classes at night after working a full 10-hour day at my engineering job. I was surrounded by bright, ambitious 20-somethings who were all dreaming of a life in the arts. They were full of passion and theory. I was full of a cold, quiet, and methodical rage. I became a machine. I read every book, every article, every case study on museum management. I learned the language. I learned the players. I learned the rules of the game. My engineering brain, which was so good at seeing systems, began to see the museum world not as a place of culture and beauty, but as a complex machine with gears and levers and stress points. And I began to see how to make that machine work for me. The second year was about entry. I had the degree. Now I needed to get my foot in the door. I couldn't just apply for a senior position. I had no experience. So I did what I had to do. I took a massive pay cut and I took a job, a low-level, unglamorous job. I became the assistant facilities manager at a small, struggling contemporary art museum on the other side of the city. It was a humbling, soul-crushing step down. My old colleagues at the engineering firm thought I had lost my mind. I went from managing multi-million-dollar construction projects to overseeing the janitorial staff and fixing leaky toilets in the museum's basement. But I wasn't just fixing toilets, I was learning. I was inside the machine, I was watching, I was listening. I saw, from the ground up, how a museum really worked. The petty politics of the curatorial department, the desperate, constant struggle for funding, the fragile egos of the artists and the even more fragile egos of the wealthy donors. And I started to apply my own unique skill set. I was a project manager after all, and a museum, I discovered, is just one big, inefficiently run project. I used my engineering background to completely overhaul the museum's facilities management system. I created new, efficient workflows for the maintenance staff. I renegotiated the contracts with our HVAC and security vendors, saving the museum hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. My work got noticed. The museum's director, a smart but overwhelmed woman named Sarah, started to see that the quiet, overqualified guy in the basement was actually solving problems that no one else could. She started to pull me into higher-level meetings. She started to ask for my opinion, not on art, but on budgets, on logistics, on strategy. The third year was about the ascent. I was no longer just the facilities guy. I had proven my worth. I had shown them that my outsider perspective, my engineer's brain, was a massive asset. When the museum's director of operations retired, Sarah offered me the job. I was back in a senior management role. But this time, it was in their world, and I was good at it. I was very, very good at it. I took the messy, chaotic, and often irrational world of a nonprofit arts institution, and I imposed on it the cold, clean logic of an engineering project. I streamlined their ticketing system. I optimized their event scheduling. I rebuilt their budget from the ground up. I made the museum, for the first time in its history, profitable. All the while I was watching Daniel. I was tracking his career like a hawk. He was moving up just as he had planned. He was now the deputy director at his prestigious museum. He was getting glowing profiles in the arts section of the newspaper. He and Chloe were the art world's new power couple. They were, I am sure, completely oblivious to my own quiet and methodical climb. I was in a different, smaller, less glamorous corner of their universe. I was no threat. I was a ghost. The fourth year was about the leap. I had a track record now. I had a reputation as a kind of miracle worker. The guy who could turn a struggling arts institution into a model of efficiency and profitability. And I knew that the biggest, most prestigious museum in the country, the National Institute of Art, the one Daniel saw as his birthright, was in trouble. It was a massive, bloated, and deeply dysfunctional institution. It had a world-class collection, but it was bleeding money. Its board of trustees was in a panic. They had just fired their longtime director, and they were looking for a savior. They were looking for a businessman, a strategist, an operator. They were not looking for another art historian. I applied for the job, the director of the National Institute of Art. It was the most audacious, most arrogant move of my life. On paper, I was laughably underqualified. I had only been in the museum world for 3 years, but I had a plan. I spent a month preparing for the interview. I used my research skills to conduct a deep forensic analysis of the Institute's finances, of its operations, of its systemic, deep-rooted problems. I didn't write a cover letter. I wrote a 100-page turnaround plan. I walked into that interview with the entire 20-person board of trustees, and I didn't talk about art. I talked about logistics. I talked about supply chain optimization for traveling exhibits. I talked about data-driven marketing strategies to increase visitor engagement. I talked about renegotiating their union contracts. I spoke their language. The language of the bottom line. They were stunned. They had been interviewing a parade of stuffy academic art historians who had talked about curatorial vision. I was the first person who had walked in and talked to them like what they were, the board of directors of a failing billion-dollar corporation. 2 weeks later, they offered me the job. I was the new director of the National Institute of Art. I was sitting on the throne that Daniel believed was his. I had spent 4 years of my life, 4 years of grueling, relentless work, to get to this one. Single point. The 5th year was about setting the trap. I spent my first year as director cleaning house. I implemented my turnaround plan. I stabilized the museum's finances. I won the trust of the board and the staff. And then I created a new position. A position that had never existed before. The Chief Operating Officer for Strategic Growth. It was a big, fancy, and slightly vague title, and it was a position designed from the ground up for one person and one person only. I knew through the industry grapevine that Daniel was getting restless. His own museum was stable, but it was smaller. He had hit a ceiling. The job at the National Institute was the only step up, and I had just taken it. He was feeling trapped. So I put the job posting out, and as I knew he would, he applied. He had to. It was the perfect next step in his glorious career. And Chloe, I am sure, pushed him to it. They saw the job as their ticket to the very top of the mountain. He didn't know, of course, that I was the new director. The museum had kept my appointment relatively quiet while I was in the initial turnaround phase. The big public announcement was still weeks away. He thought he was applying for a job under the old interim management. He made the shortlist, of course. His resume was impeccable, and I arranged for his final interview to be with the new, as yet unannounced director. And so we arrived at that morning. At 9 a.m. on the top floor of the museum I now ran, the culmination of a 5-year plan. 5 years of my life, 182,625 days of cold, patient, and methodical work had all led to this single, beautiful, and utterly perfect moment. The look on his face when he walked into my office was a masterpiece of shattered arrogance. The confusion, the dawning horror, the slow, sickening realization that the world as he knew it had just been turned completely upside down. "Michael?" he whispered, his voice a ghost. "What are you doing here?" I let the question hang in the air for a moment, savoring it. And then I began my performance, the one I had been rehearsing in the quiet of my own mind for 5 long years. "Mr. Davenport retired last week," I said, my voice calm, professional, the voice of a CEO. "I'm the new director of the Institute. Please have a seat, Daniel. We have a few things to discuss." He just stood there, frozen, his expensive hand-stitched leather briefcase suddenly looking like a cheap prop. He looked around my office at the sweeping views of the city, at the priceless modern art on the walls, all on loan from the museum's collection, of course, at me, sitting in the big, powerful chair that was supposed to have been his. And I could see the gears in his brilliant, ruthless mind grinding to a halt. He finally, numbly, sat down in the chair opposite my desk. The same kind of chair that I had sat in his office 5 years ago when he was the powerful one. "I have your resume here," I said, picking up a sheet of paper from my desk, though I didn't need to look at it. I had his entire career, his every move memorized. "It's impressive on paper." I leaned back in my chair. "But I have some concerns. I've been doing a bit of my own due diligence. You see, the thing about the art world, Daniel, is that it's very small. People talk, and what they say about you is interesting." I proceeded with a calm, surgical precision to dismantle his entire career right in front of his face. I didn't raise my voice, I just presented the facts. The facts that I had spent years quietly gathering, through back channels and old contacts. "For example," I said, looking at a blank sheet of paper, "I was talking to a colleague from your time at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. He mentioned an interesting story about a missing acquisition fund, a fund that you were in charge of. It was never proven, of course, you were very clever, but the whispers, they linger." His face went pale. "And then there's the matter of the Hearst retrospective," I continued, my voice a relentless, quiet monotone. "The one you curated at your last job. It was a huge success. But I found it interesting that the primary logistics contractor for that multi-million-dollar exhibition was a company that, upon closer inspection, appears to be a shell corporation owned by your own brother-in-law. A clear and massive conflict of interest, unethical, and quite possibly illegal." He started to sputter. That's a lie. I can explain." "Can you?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Can you also explain the very credible rumors I've heard about your management style? The allegations of harassment from two of your former female subordinates? Allegations that were quietly settled out of court with a very strict non-disclosure agreement?" He was no longer just pale. He was sweating. The powerful, confident man who had walked into my office was gone, replaced by a cornered, terrified animal. "You see, Daniel," I said, leaning forward, my voice dropping to a low, confidential tone. "I'm a builder. I'm a project manager. And my current project is this institution, and I will not allow its foundation to be compromised by a man with a history of ethical inconsistencies." I let the word hang in the air between us. "So I'm afraid this is where our conversation ends," I said, my voice returning to its cool, professional register. "This position, the Chief Operating Officer for Strategic Growth, requires a level of integrity that, frankly, you do not possess. We will not be moving forward with your candidacy." He just sat there, his mouth opening and closing like a fish, unable to form words. He had walked in here expecting to be anointed the new prince of the art world, and he had instead been systematically and completely destroyed. And then I delivered the final killing blow, the one I had been saving for 5 years. I picked up the termination letter from my desk, the one with his name on it. "Oh," I said, with a look of casual, dawning realization. "I seem to have the wrong paperwork in front of me. This is for you, Daniel, but it's from your current employer." I slid the letter across the desk. It was a termination letter from his own museum. He stared at it, his eyes wide with uncomprehending horror. What is this?" "I took the liberty of having a conversation with your current board of directors yesterday," I explained calmly. "I shared with them my concerns, the same concerns I just shared with you. I presented them with the evidence I have gathered regarding your financial and ethical misdeeds. They were, as you can imagine, very interested. They have decided to terminate your contract, effective immediately." "For cause?" He looked at me. and in his eyes I saw the full, crushing weight of his complete and utter annihilation. He hadn't just lost a job. He had lost all the jobs. His career, his reputation, his entire future had been erased in a single, quiet, 10-minute conversation. "But why?" he whispered, his voice a broken, pleading thing. "Why would you do this?" I stood up and I walked to the window, looking down at the city below. "5 years ago," I said, my back to him, "you stole my wife. And she told me that I was a man who lacked vision, that I was happy building things for other people, while you built empires." I turned to face him, and for the first time, I let a small, cold smile touch my lips. "So I decided to build an empire of my own," I said. "And I built it for one reason, and one reason only. So I could have the simple, quiet, and beautiful pleasure of looking you in the eye and telling you from the very top of it, you're fired." The aftermath was a study in quiet, cascading ruin. Daniel's firing for cause from a major museum, with the shadow of a sealed but widely rumored scandal hanging over his head, effectively ended his career. He was blacklisted. The Golden Boy's shine had been permanently and irrevocably tarnished. No reputable institution would touch him. And Chloe, my ex-wife, she had hitched her star to a rocket that had just exploded on the launch pad. The empire she had left me for had crumbled to dust before it was even built. The life of power, of status, of being the wife of the most important man in the art world, it was all gone. Their relationship, built as it was on the shaky foundations of ambition and shared betrayal, did not survive the collapse. He, a broken, disgraced man with no future, was no longer the powerful figure she had fallen for. And she, in his eyes, was now a reminder of his own catastrophic failure. They separated less than 6 months later. The last I heard, Daniel had taken a job as a consultant for a small, third-rate auction house in another state. And Chloe, she had tried to get her old job back at her museum, but her association with Daniel and the quiet, persistent rumors of the real reason for my own divorce had made her toxic. She was working as a freelance art dealer, a ghost haunting the edges of the world she had once been so sure she would conquer. As for me, my war was over, and I was left in the quiet, empty silence of my victory. I didn't revel in their downfall. The satisfaction I thought I would feel, the sweet taste of revenge, was a much more complicated and somber thing in reality. I had won. But the cost had been immense. I had sacrificed 5 years of my life. I had become a man I didn't recognize, a cold, methodical machine of vengeance. I didn't stay as the director of the National Institute. I had never wanted the job. I had only wanted the power it conferred for one single glorious day. I stayed for a year, the year it took to fully stabilize the institution and to find a worthy successor, a brilliant art historian who actually loved the art more than the administration. And then I walked away. I took the money I had made, a considerable fortune, and I did something that the old me, the simple project manager, would have understood. I started a foundation, a small private foundation that gives grants to help keep arts education programs alive in public schools. I was building something again, not for myself, for other people. I live a quiet life now. I have a small house on a lake, filled with books and blueprints for projects I will never build. I don't date. I don't know if I ever will again. The fortress I built around my heart in those 5 years is a formidable one. Looking back on it all, on the man I was and the man I became, it all feels like a story from another life. The pain of Chloe's betrayal is a faint, dull scar now. The all-consuming rage that drove me for 5 years is gone, replaced by a quiet and sometimes lonely peace. Was it worth it? The sacrifice? The cost to my own soul? Yes, but not for the reason you think. The revenge, the final perfect moment of firing him, that was the engine. But it wasn't the destination. The real victory was not in his destruction. It was in my own, painful, and ultimately necessary reconstruction. Chloe had told me I lacked vision. She had told me I was not an empire builder. And in the cruelest, most ironic twist of fate, she was the one who gave me the motivation to prove her wrong. I had to become the thing she valued in order to show her how worthless it truly was. I had to build an empire just to have the strength to walk away from it. And in doing so, I found a different kind of vision, a quieter one, a better one. So, yeah, that's the story. That whole period was the most difficult and defining of my life. It taught me about the profound destructive power of ambition, but it also taught me something else. It taught me that the quiet, methodical, and often invisible work of building is always, in the end, more powerful than the loud, glamorous, and ultimately hollow work of empire. I'm sharing this because I know so many of you have been made to feel small. You've been told you're not enough. You've been left behind by someone chasing a bigger, brighter, shinier dream. My story, I hope, is a reminder that your worth is not defined by someone else's ambition, and that sometimes the longest, hardest, and most difficult projects are the ones that are the most worth building. Whew, thanks for sticking with me through that absolute marathon. I know it was a lot, but a 5-year plan, you can't really explain that in 5 minutes, can you? It feels good to finally close the books on that project. If this story resonated with you or if your jaw was on the floor during that final meeting, please give this video a thumbs up. It really helps. And I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Was I a hero or a man who went too far? What part of this story was the most unbelievable to you? The 5 years of climbing? The final, epic firing? All right, everyone, that's it from me for this one. Take care of yourselves, know what you're building, and I'll see you in the next video.